The Night School. Reflections on Education. William Ospina. Colombian writer, novelist, and critic born in Hervio, a municipality in the department of Tolima. The Night School. Reflections on Education. There are naive questions, tedious questions, poorly formulated questions, questions posed with inadequate self-criticism. But every question is a cry to understand the world. Carl Sagan, The World and Its Demons. At some point in his retirement in the woods of Walden, Henry David Thoreau told a peasant that Plato had defined man in Athens as a biped without feathers, and that Diogenes the Cynic, to mock that definition, had plucked a hen and let it loose around the academy shouting, "Here is Plato's man." The peasant, after listening carefully to the story, instead of laughing, said thoughtfully, perhaps he should have added that the knees bend in the opposite direction. That story always comes back to me when I reflect on knowledge, and I think that perhaps much of what can be said about the sages and their knowledge is contained in it. Very often ordinary people, who have no academic training, no degrees, make more sensible observations about reality than scholars and professors. But it is that our ideas of wisdom and knowledge, and all our pedagogy, rest on very schematic and formal assumptions. It is thought that human beings come to know exclusively through the path of academic education, and that education consists in separating ourselves from everything that we originally were to enroll ourselves in an established and illustrious tradition, change false notions for true notions, provide us with information about the universe, train us, correct us. Before study, it is thought, there is only error and clumsiness in us. What we originally are has a bad reputation. I remember a cartoon in which a girl complains that advertising, when it wants to say that even a clumsy person can handle a certain instrument, says, even a child can do it. However, many modern studies remind us that there are talents and skills in children that adults already want. I have heard the story of the decipherment of the Mayan glyphs, and of the role that the presence of a child played in this task of recognizing a script. A 10-year-old boy, the son of a couple of archaeologists and linguists, had accompanied them to Tikal or Palenque, and while the group of professionals met to exchange information and conjectures, the boy played among the ruins. At some point, when they were having an intense discussion about the stone stels, the boy, who heard them, intervened and told them, "No, it's just that there are some drawings of air, others of land and others of water." The debaters looked at him in astonishment. The boy then took them through the fields and showed them the stele in which the theme was air, those in which the theme was earth, and those in which the theme was water. What the elders, wise men, and specialists had not been able to see, that child who was playing had seen. With the extraordinary capacity for attention and memory of childhood, he had established a system of correspondences that the others would hardly have reached. Thanks to his curiosity, his ability to play and his memory, it was the presence of that child that shortened that deciphering process. Our culture tends to see in children only projects. Children are the future, they continually repeat to us, and with this they tend to forget that children are also something present, an exciting present, full of learning capacity and also teaching capacity. Seeing them as something still unfinished, they are converted only into receivers of information, passive subjects of the discipline, empty jars that must be filled with data of culture, and they are underestimated as creators, as researchers, as realities of the present. They are mere recipients of the supposed knowledge of others. The educational system seems to be founded on the principle that only adults can know and that their authority rests therein. The process of drawing people out of themselves and lavishing them with high doses of education is beginning earlier and earlier. It is understood that it is urgent that they receive lessons, that they learn to read, to repeat notions, to consume shows. The invasive modern society wants to saturate children with provisions from the cradle, and is very concerned with the issues of early stimulation and even the early detection of talents and geniuses. As adults fear loneliness and emptiness, as they are sometimes gripped by boredom, they perhaps think that it is necessary to save the little ones by permanently filling their time and attention, not allowing gaps in their lives. Many children are sometimes saved by poverty, which prevents their parents from overwhelming them with objects to the point of being unable to focus their attention and affection on any of them. One of the most wonderful virtues of childhood is that in it, as in India, it is impossible to access the idea of poverty, because children who have few resources often discover the most amazing of all toys, the universe. A body, a meadow, a tree, the flight of a bird, the tiger in its cage, the rigorous path of the ants, the wind that closes and opens doors, the shadow at the feet of each thing, the detailed day, the night of mystery and abyss. Those infinite treasures can be enjoyed by those who have nothing if authoritarianism and clumsiness do not prevent it. There are adults who cannot see a child playing without feeling that they are wasting their time. And there is even the case of parents who, when they see their children reading, for example, tell them, "You who are not doing anything, go bring me this or that." In any case, the logic of industrial society, which thanks to television reaches even the poorest early, is invariable: provide, supply goods, information, shows, generate the need for a lot of things that are pretended to be indispensable, and they are nothing more than trifles. Holderlin, a sage to whom humanity will have to return more and more often, wrote, "Let us leave the man alone in his cradle. Let's not try to open the hermetically sealed cocoons of his being, let's not expel him too soon from the cabin in which he spends his childhood. Let us not do too little for him, lest he dispense with us and distinguish us from himself. Let us not do too much either, so that he does not notice our power or his and thus also distinguishes us from himself, that in his house man realizes as late as possible that men exist, and that there are other things around him, for only thus will he become a man. The most important thing to know that a human being can achieve can perhaps only come out of himself. This does not mean that he should grow up indifferent to the world around him, it means that his questions should arise from himself, that the most valid knowledge is the one that solves problems of his relationship with the world, with others, and with himself. To be something you have to be someone, said Goethe, and only by allowing the plurality of our emotions and concerns to speak will we be in a position to truly dialogue with the world. That before entering education we have been allowed to perceive what is in us, the questions that we bring, the inclinations that the trinity of character, destiny, and chance dictates in our being, the way in which our being has begun to dialogue physical relationship with the cultural environment and with the world. Chesterton said that children will rule in heaven but that on earth they have to obey, and without a doubt there are many matters in which the experience of parents, their good sense and their principle of authority must prevail, but it is a mistake to consider children as incomplete beings and approaching them only to impose things, when it could be so advantageous to also approach them to learn. They are hardly allowed to begin to know who they are, what things in the universe move or disturb them, before prescribing a homogeneous knowledge and an external destiny. The result is that we are only allowed to start thinking as individuals and wondering about our inclinations after a long period of plundering, imposing, and nullifying all primitive force. Kafka wrote, "Believing in progress does not mean believing that there has already been progress, that would not be a faith." In the same way, believing in the necessity of the school, of the academy, does not mean believing that the school has already reached its fullness. That is why it is important to point out the errors and shortcomings of the educational system, since education too, so to speak, has to be educated. One continually hears people say that the solution to the problems of their country, that the solution to the problems of the world, lies in education. The thesis seems obvious, but what education are we talking about? Even the officials of the Holy Inquisition had educational methods. Nazi Germany published primers to teach anti-Semitism, there are schools for suicide bombers, there are educational models made to perpetuate racial discrimination, social exclusion, there are academies that are strongholds of the aristocratic spirit, hotbeds of repulsion and mental rigidity. What if, even admitting that education is the solution to many problems, we had to accept that education, a certain type of education, is also the problem? What an exciting challenge for the intelligence, not to limit ourselves to celebrating education in the abstract, but to demand from us an idea about what education should be. How to distinguish between the discipline that forms beings with principles and responsibilities and the arbitrariness that forms submissive and negligent beings. How to distinguish between the education that forms human beings with criteria and character and the education that hardly informs and that blurs the personality. In this, as in many cases, the answers hardly matter. The most important thing is to formulate the questions well. We must be wary of the school that does not accept singularity but strives to blur and standardize individuals, of the school that combats all originality as indiscipline, of the school that ends up representing a kind of revenge of adults against minors, and of the repetitions and classifications of old age against the imagination of youth. We must move towards an education that is not limited to informing and training, that does not exaggerate the cult of competitiveness, that favors the ability to create, the joy of searching, the spirit of solidarity. Uniforms abound as well as arbitrary grading systems, repetition contests, mere worship of what others have created, mechanical and obtuse discipline. When Plato said that knowledge cannot be transmitted from one person to another as water is passed from a full container to an empty one through a string of wool, he was undoubtedly suggesting that knowledge, more than an accumulation of certainties and of information, is fundamentally an attitude. An attitude that allows taking advantage of the information to reach new conclusions, taking advantage of some notions to try new answers, using a set of technical achievements to propose new challenges. It is not possible to exaggerate the importance of the warehouse of knowledge that humanity possesses today, of the ocean of memory that it manages today, but at the same time we must not exaggerate the importance of the academy to the point of disdaining all the other paths that can be traveled in the search for knowledge that is a source of serenity, that allows us to help others and improve the world. Some of the beings who have most influenced humanity are not exactly children of the academy. We have no idea what school Buddha, Socrates, Christ, or Shakespeare attended. We simply see in the imagination Buddha meditating, Socrates conversing, Christ walking and preaching, Shakespeare writing, the rest is silence. A certain narcissistic academicism tends to disqualify autodidacts as suspected of lack of rigor. According to them, only the academy is capable of providing a wealth of information and learning resources, only the academy can teach everything. And more than one self-taught scholar is tempted to use that poisonous phrase of Wilde against academics: yes, they know everything, but it is the only thing they know. Leaving aside the controversy, we must agree that we call knowledge many different things, and that many of the fundamental knowledge of the species were conquered far from the cloisters. Nietzsche, who had a complex and tense relationship with the universities, once wrote, no doubt as a challenge, that extreme sentence, "We only know what we know how to do." It seems like a concession to pragmatism, but it is also a theorist's tribute to the vast universal knowledge of artisans and masons, farmers and workers, mechanics and artists, those who already made instruments long before the appearance of modern technology, who they gave welfare to the species long before the appearance of industry, they built cities long before the appearance of architecture faculties, they transformed trees into rooms, into cabinets for pleasure, into boats to go on adventures, into guitars, and even in sarcophagi to descend to rest. A tribute from the philosopher to the man of action, who does not theorize about what he knows how to do, but who handles unquestionable knowledge. After so many centuries, we are enrolled in complex educational systems that have not only developed admirable resources but have also complicated their mechanisms to the point of absurdity. Even the most sensible pedagogy can be aggravated by sinister mechanisms of exclusion in which to graduate is to survive the tests of Hercules, to have been more patient than Job and more competitive than a derby jockey. Our national educational system, for example, has invented a strenuous mechanism to deny the validity of the high school diplomas it grants through further examinations. It pretends to be testing the knowledge and suitability of the students, when in fact it is covering up its scandalous ineptitude to offer places to all graduates and to guarantee the continuity of the process. For many of those who manage to survive the war, at the end of their university experience, the subsequent frustration of not finding a job still awaits them, and to discover with astonishment, after decades of academic superstition, that traffickers make a better living and the smugglers than the young men of letters with their laurels still green on their temples. This is even more surprising if one considers that education is offered to young people almost exclusively as a training mechanism for production, as a way to integrate into the labor market, a kind of kindergarten for the industry. Already this reduction of knowledge to the condition of a mere tributary of production, of training to obtain a job, is a deformation that explains why professional training can sometimes be so mechanical and so dry, but it is more serious to find that neither for that purpose works fully. It is natural that the study serves pragmatic purposes, but traditionally, education aimed at the total formation of individuals, not only the transmission of skills and theoretical knowledge, general information and specialized data, but the formation of character, the strengthening of the will, the generation of citizen behaviors, social responsibility and personal ethics. In a world that loses its ideals, in a world left to its own pragmatic fury, these things are no longer considered important, and, in contrast to its reputation as a moral beacon and spiritual guide, many powers seek to make the school the first in abandoning them. The truth is that if education is training and transmission of practical skills, workshops, factories, and offices are much more competent to impart it than classrooms, often ready to be contaminated by everything except reality. The classrooms sometimes seem vestiges of those ages that believed only in the revealed truth, administered by a church, that considered impure and vulgar any concession to experience. It causes perplexity that we are locked up in gloomy enclosures to initiate us in the knowledge of nature, that we must listen for hours and for months to a boring and fossil knowledge while outside the miracle of the world runs. It is indeed strange to study botany far from the woods, to study the kingdoms of nature in rigid human halls. It is sad that rather than helping us to be individuals we are forced to be submissive herds. And as Stanislaus Ulta used to repeat it, it is incomprehensible that the days are arbitrarily divided between classes and recess, between study time and pleasure time, so that we get used to thinking that knowledge is painful and that pleasure is useless, when the truth is that it only frees us and only that knowledge that has been a delight to conquer lasts in us. The history of the great individuals of the West is a history of great rebels, of acute critics of tradition, beings who, due to their invincible affective or mental singularity, manage to escape the overwhelming influence of conventions. These also end up being the great teachers, because the freedom they conquer is a fresh wind at the crossroads of civilization. Every great spirit is liberating and transforming, precisely because it transcends norms and models, it already suggests a new measure and a new order. Nothing is more profitable than curiosity and lack of dogma. Never have more ideas circulated, nor were they more diverse and contradictory, never was the Western spirit perhaps so lively and fertile as in the Greece of the so-called pre-Socratic philosophers. Between them everything seemed possible, the world seemed docile to the explorations of the spirit, a new and different universe was born before each one of their thoughts. And the best thing is not the amazing diversity of the minds of those Democrites and Parmenids, Anaxagoras, Empedocles, and Heraclitus, but the possibility they had of coexisting, without getting in the way, so many different universes, thanks to the fact that there was no great truth, a great teacher, a great Bible with its corresponding great inquisitor disqualifying so many flowers in the name of the sacred rose. A certain academic routine insists on offering us knowledge only as repetition. It requires us only to remember the lessons, to repeat what we have learned, not to create something new. Perhaps the hypothesis of an original knowledge of the student would place him in a situation at least equal to the teacher, and our pedagogy loves hierarchies, subordination, an order where the supposed knowledge confers authority and power, where knowledge works somehow as an instrument of domination. But now comes the newest method, refined by new technical and propaganda resources, which consists not only in thinking that knowledge already exists somewhere, that it is not necessary to produce it from the specific qualities of our existence, but that the saber is a custom-made merchandise, which is sold properly packaged and ready for consumption. Modern society is beginning to replace the idea of temples of knowledge where humans go to learn, with the idea that there are factories of accumulated knowledge that can offer us all the knowledge necessary for life at home. This knowledge, of course, is reduced to an apparatus of formulas and tricks for everyday life, a plethora of images, artifacts, and information that do not even leave us in a position to find out if that modern practical life, made of passivity and consumption, it has something to do with life. If there is any point in standardizing ourselves, concentrating on cities, erasing our differences, proscribing everything that can make adventure on Earth valuable and unique, it is so that the knowledge they sell us can be standardized and offered to everyone equally, so that it is rapidly and massively consumed. Holderlin said that in his childhood he was not educated by schools but by the murmur of the groves. And he added, I understood the silence of the ether / I never understood the words of man. I think our education deserves to be improved. It is still too full of impositions, of obvious and subtle violence. The tradition that we perpetuate tends to massify, to dissolve the singular, to extinguish all original voice, to nullify all invention that is not recyclable by the market. There were ages of generosity, hospitality, detachment, and heroism, and today only the ideal of profit seems respectable. But if for a moment humanity could be deaf to all its knowledge and its traditions, to all the institutions built in centuries of bewilderment and violence, perhaps it could hear the murmur of its true wisdom, what the timeless voices teach and warn. Of nature and the abysses of its own history. Before the fascinating and omnipresent modern means of communication, which invade and confuse everything, before the venerable universities that transmit their knowledge, before the workshops of the Middle Ages, which respectfully shared skills, before civilized Greece, which knew how to teach by conversation and example, there was wisdom. Despite what the flares of progress and the arrogance of modernity claim, there has always been wisdom, and the oldest were perhaps the deepest and most essential. They knew how to preserve the world, they knew how to celebrate the universe, they engendered languages and myths, they built with their inspiration and with their faith greater beauties than those ever built by utilitarianism and reason. To those who claim that academic scholars are superior to common people, and that peoples are ignorant, we must remind them that it was not wise doctors but ignorant peoples who coined languages, refined trades, ennobled the world of legends and mythologies and found the gods on their way. That the deepest wisdom always sprouted from souls in deep contact with reality, and it was always the fruit of a movement of the creative spirit, not a vain repetition of known things. That knowledge cannot be transmitted by violence or greed, but, at best, as Goethe thought, by love. That thousands and millions of lips faithful to life and to themselves were the ones who wove the language in which Shakespeare, a fellow member of La Escuela de la Noche, finally speaking for all, mentioned, the prophetic soul / of the wide world dreaming the things to eats, the prophetic spirit / of the immense world dreaming of things to come, and that often the most sensible words, and also the most saving ones, can come out of the most illiterate and humblest lips. Finish. The Night School. Reflections on Education. William Ospina.